Welcome to Poker Hands Dissected. Here, we're going to be taking a hand submitted to us by a player, and instead of just breaking down simply what occurred in the hand and giving you my advice on what that player should have done, we're gonna look at it from the perspective of the player. And that's the thing, most poker coaches will break down a hand and they'll discuss what they should have done. But the reality is there's many different ways of climbing a mountain. There's many different ways of playing this game. And I kind of want to show you that by breaking down the thought process or the reasons why a player is doing specific actions at the table. And this serves a bunch of purposes. First, we get to actually coach this player and give them concrete advice. Two, we get to exploit this player, meaning you're going to see these types of players at your table, and I want you to be able to see how you could actively exploit a thought process like this. We're also going to be talking about bigger themes in poker and applying them specifically to the hand. So this is going to be really interesting. Let's start with our first one. So he raises to 7 with pocket jacks. His reasoning is 3.5 is usually a standard raise at 1-2. A couple things to say about this. First, 3.5x is never usually going to work at 1-2. It's too low of a raise. I mean, for the most part, you gotta be breaking that 5x, 6x, 7x number. I mean, I get so many emails right now that are like, Blake, you don't understand. I raised to $15 with pocket kings. I got 4 callers, blah, 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 blah. 3.5x is just way too small in today's games. Also, you need to understand that standards are usually not the best way to approach the game. The table has its own standard. The table has its own norm. You have to adjust to that. So you can start off raising whatever you normally raise, but if you see that 5 players are calling you, you need to adjust. So you want to think about standards as relative to a table, but you not think about it relative to, poker in general. And also, he doesn't give us any other information here. He just basically says 3.5x is his standard raise. He doesn't tell us about the dynamics. He doesn't say that that was the good raise size for that table. Nothing, just that. Opponent raises to 25 in the cutoff. It folds around to him and he calls. So let's take a look at his why. So he says, cutoff was to my left and was constantly raising when I entered the pot. So it's the first red flag, constantly raising when I entered the pot. I felt as if he was specifically targeting me. It was uncomfortable for me, and I was having trouble in pots against him. I had about 150 at this point and did not want to go all in, so I just called, figuring I might still be ahead. A couple things to say about this. So first, constantly raising when I entered a pot. Now, I've received at this point, I don't know, probably like thousands, tens of thousands of emails from poker players, and constantly raising or constantly or always is terms that just are usually red flags. Usually players aren't constantly bullying you. Usually this is some sort of self-perception. I don't really know right now. So I don't know if this player actually is constantly raising, and I don't know his definition of what constantly means. So for example, for me, if you're playing at a table and you played for 2 hours and you play, let's say, 12 hands, and 10 out of 12 hands, somebody's 3-betting you in position, they're bullying you, all right? That's constantly. But for this player, he might just play once or twice. We don't really know. So we don't know if that's a perception or a reality. And the problem with that is that perception is what's informing our opponent's range. Meaning, if he is constantly raising when he entered a pot, this guy's range is just super wide, and it changes the relative hand strength of jacks. If our player is wrong and just really worried that this player is bullying them when they don't really have evidence, it changes the dynamic. That being said, we don't really know if he's specifically targeting him or not, but we're going to take this player's word for it. So we're going to assume when we proceed with this hand that this guy is constantly raising, constantly bullying, and probably has a ton of trash. But anyways, this other thing I don't like is I might still be ahead of him. Well, if this guy is constantly raising you, and if he's bullying you, pocket jacks might not be ahead. I mean, you're crushing him for the most part if this guy's doing this. So I don't like that terminology. We really want to understand the player's range and get definitive with our approach. This is like that whole long-term thinking in poker where it's like, yes, our opponent might have aces right now and that might suck. But the reality is, for the most part, we're crushing their hands that they're raising to 25 with if they're bullying us. Also, just wanted to say, a $25 raise looks more of like that bullying sizing. I think that most competent players are going to size a little bit smaller if they do have a hand like aces or kings or something like that to not scare away the kind of player that they would be bullying. But what hands could our opponent have right now? Yeah, sure, our opponent could be crushing us with ace, kings, and queens, right? And we're 50-50 against this. But the reality is, a bunch of trash hands here, and they could have all of this if they're constantly bullying us. They could have so many different hands. So yeah, you're losing a very small percentage of hand, but most of the time you're getting raised with trash and you're vastly ahead. And this is the one time where you shouldn't be fearful. This is the one time where you should be happy the fact that this player is bullying you and you have pocket jack. So a lot of weird perceptions here. And just understand this, guys. When you're at the poker table, you're sometimes playing against players like our student right now. And they're really easy to push off hands because they have this perception that everything beats them and they're not really critically thinking about their opponent's range. So an interesting dynamic, but let's see what he does going forward. So obviously he calls, and just to say one thing about this call, I happen to really like this call, but not for his reasons, right? I like this call because, I mean, if we 4-bet right here, we're getting all the hands that we could potentially get more value from to probably fold. Way more likely to get value from calling in a spot with jacks, but he doesn't do it for the right reasons. So, flops 9-8-6, he checks. And he checks because my hand is still good and I was hoping he would bet. Okay, so that's fine. That's the first fine piece of logic. So I'm assuming that this player is operating from the perspective that since there's no ace, king, or queen out there, his jacks are fine, which is how most players would proceed. He's not really I guess he doesn't use the term value, but checking here because he knows he can get his opponent to bet. I think that's fine. If his opponent's actually bullying him, his opponent's probably going to bet 100% of the time when he checks back to them. So this is great. Then his opponent bets 40 and he calls, which is what we would expect him to do. Now we have a queen of diamonds and our player checks. Opponent bets 75 and he folds. He says, the turn came out the queen of diamonds, which is a really bad card for me. Of course, so I checked. He bet 75, which is a pretty big bet, and I tanked for a while and decided to fold, thinking I am probably behind at this point. So this is where, this is a problem in the sense that he should have probably shoved the flop if he had this kind of mentality. So this is the kind of player that really doesn't have the ability to play post-flop poker right now. He's too card focused. He's not actively thinking about his opponent's range, which makes multiple streets dangerous. And I really feel that if he's worried about the queen of diamonds, it also means he's worried about any heart, any ace, any king, or any queen. So there's so many cards that come on the turn of the river that has this player shut down. If that's the case, he shouldn't have let it get to the river. He should have just shoved on the flop. I mean, I think that would have been the best line for this player and the most profitable for him. For you listening, maybe not, but for this player, it just, he can't, he's going into danger zone too often here. And his opponents are just going to opponents are not going to like slow down on the turn if they're really bullying. And if any ace, king, or queen comes, like we've seen, they're going to bet. So not really good here. Shouldn't have let the turn happen. And this is one of the things that happens with these players is that because they're not actively thinking about their opponent's range, it's just more fear. That's what happens. Like fear comes from a lack of information. When you start to have information, when you start to process things at the table, when you start to critically think about what your opponents can have, it hedges or negates that fear. This player's just not operating logically. Like at this point, there's still a ton of hands that fire on that turn that he gets value from. Like you cannot, if you're really being constantly bullied, you can't just say you're beat right now. And also, he's not really taking into consideration stack size. He's not really thinking critically about how he can set up his hand to get more value. It's none of that thinking. It's very basic thinking. It's very fear-based poker. And this player needs work. And the reality is that's what happens when you're not actively thinking about a range. You just don't actually have, everything's going to be scary, right? All of a sudden, for pocket jacks, if any card comes, queens, if a queen comes, a king comes, it's scary because you're not thinking what is the likelihood that someone has something or doesn't have something. So it's really important for us to make sure that we actively do that and make sure we see those little holes in our game or else we're never going to win. Now, this is a very basic hand today. Not that, I think it's pretty straightforward, pretty standard. Later, we're going to be looking at players that are a lot better and have more complicated thought processes and looking through the problems for those. But Please let me know if you have any questions or comments. Post below. Let me know if you like the new format.